He waited 7 years. 7 years of checking his phone. 7 years of visiting the same coffee shop, hoping to see her face. 7 years of carrying her photograph like a prayer. Then one rainy night, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was proof she was alive. But she wasn't alone. She had a daughter. And the man who loved her had no idea if he was still wanted in her life. This is a story about love that survived the impossible. About a choice that takes courage. About the moment you realize that sometimes the person you lost never actually left your heart. Stay with us to discover what happened when two people who never stopped loving each other finally found their way home. The coffee stain never really faded from Daniel's memory. 7 years, and he could still see it perfectly. The way the dark liquid bloomed across the white pages of her book like an apology spreading across someone's face. He could still hear her laugh, that surprised, genuine laugh that made his younger self feel like he'd done something brave instead of clumsy. That laugh had cost him everything, and he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. The coffee shop was different now. They'd changed the furniture 3 times, repainted the walls, rotated the menu 3 seasons over. But Daniel still came on Thursday mornings. Not because he thought she would magically appear, though somewhere deep in his heart, that hope never completely died. He came because it was the only place in Chicago where he still felt close to who he used to be, before the empty nights, before the unanswered calls, before he learned that people could just vanish from your life without explanation, without closure, without giving you the chance to fight for them. His friend Marcus said it was unhealthy, this ritual of his. Marcus had said for years now, the way best friends do when they're watching someone slowly disappear. They'd be at bars, at dinners, at parties that Daniel only attended to please Marcus, and Marcus would pull him aside and say something like, "You've got to let her go, man. She's gone. Moving on isn't betrayal." But Marcus didn't understand. This wasn't about stubbornness. This wasn't about some romantic fantasy Daniel had constructed to avoid real life. This was about something deeper than logic or reason. When you love someone the way Daniel loved Olivia, something fundamental shifts inside you. Your heart doesn't just feel love. It becomes love. It's not something you can turn off with willpower or time. It's not something that dies because the person is gone. Daniel was 32 years old. He had built a successful career in architecture. He had designed buildings that stood in the skyline of 3 different cities. He had money, respect, and everything a man was supposed to want. And yet, every morning when he woke up, his first thought was always the same. I wonder where she is. I wonder if she's okay. I wonder if she ever thinks about me. The apartment was painfully quiet. That was the hardest part, people thought, the loneliness. But Daniel had learned to live with loneliness the way some people learn to live with chronic pain. You adjust, you manage, you find ways to make it through the day without screaming. What he couldn't adjust to was the not knowing, the absolute void of information, the way that Olivia had simply erased herself from his world, leaving no clues, no messages, no breadcrumbs to follow. He contacted everyone, police officers who grew tired of hearing him, hospitals that checked their records, her parents, who seemed to know something they wouldn't tell him, her best friend, Sarah, who once broke down on the phone and said, "I want to help you, Daniel. I really do, but I can't." Those 5 words had haunted him more than complete silence ever could. She knew something. They all knew something. But it remained locked behind doors he couldn't open. The photograph had become both a comfort and a curse. He'd kept it in his wallet since the day she left. A picture of Olivia at 25, laughing at something he'd said during a trip to the lake. Her hair was blowing across her face. Her eyes were bright with joy, and she looked like someone who had never experienced a single moment of sadness. He carried that image like evidence, proof that she had existed, that what they'd had was real and not some elaborate dream his lonely heart had constructed. Sometimes people would ask him about it. "Who's that?" they'd say, seeing him pull out the wallet. And Daniel would just smile and put away without answering. The question always made him feel like a character in a sad movie. The guy who couldn't move on, the one everyone pitied but also judged for being weak. But there was another side to this story, a side that nobody knew because Daniel kept it close to his heart. In the weeks before Olivia left, she had seemed troubled. There were hushed phone calls with her father, conversations that stopped when Daniel entered a room. She'd been distracted, worried, checking over her shoulder like someone was following her. Daniel had asked her about it so many times, and each time she'd smile and kiss him and say everything was fine. He knew it wasn't fine. He'd known it then, and the knowing without understanding had been a special kind of torture. Then the day came when Daniel got the call about the job overseas. 6 months in Mumbai, helping to design a major commercial complex. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the kind of thing that could make his career. Olivia had encouraged him to go. She'd been so supportive, so loving. She'd driven him to the airport, even though tears ran down her face the entire drive. "I'll wait for you," she'd said. And he believed her with every fiber of his being. The way you believe in things when you're 25 and you think love is the strongest force in the universe. What he didn't know was that she meant it. She did wait, but she waited from somewhere he couldn't find her. She waited in a different life, under different circumstances, separated from him not by distance, but by something infinitely more complicated. The 7th anniversary of her disappearance had come and gone with barely a whisper. Daniel was used to these painful dates by now. He'd learned to move through them, to function, to pretend it was just another day, even though his heart was breaking quietly in the spaces between his heartbeats. He'd gone to the coffee shop, of course. He'd sat at the corner table and remembered the curve of her mouth when she'd laughed. That night, he'd come home to his apartment, microwave some leftover Chinese food he wasn't hungry for, and tried to watch television but couldn't focus. Around 11 o'clock, he'd heard the mail slot open downstairs. Nothing unusual, but something made him go check. The envelope was plain white, no return address, no markings at all. But his name was written on it in handwriting he recognized immediately. Olivia's handwriting. His hand shook as he opened it. Inside was a photograph and a note. The photograph showed 2 figures, a woman who looked like an older, tired version of Olivia, standing beside a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The girl had Olivia's eyes. On the back, in that same familiar handwriting, "If you still love her, come alone." Daniel's world shifted on its axis. Every theory he constructed about what happened to her, every explanation he convinced himself of, every scenario where she'd chosen to leave and never come back, all of it crumbled. She was alive. She had a daughter. And somehow, after 7 years of silence, she wanted to see him. He didn't question it. He didn't overthink it. He called in sick to work and got in his car. The address was in Maine, a coastal town he'd never heard of. The drive was 14 hours, and Daniel did it in 16, stopping only for gas and coffee, and a moment where he pulled over to cry because the weight of possibility was too heavy to carry while driving. By the time his GPS led him down a rural road toward an old lighthouse standing on rocky cliffs overlooking the Atlantic, Daniel felt like a different person than the man who'd left Chicago. He was terrified. He was hopeful. He was angry and heartbroken, and desperate and grateful all at the same time. He was 7 years' worth of emotion compressed into a single, unbearable moment. A woman stood near the water, looking out at the ocean, even from a distance, even with 7 years of aging and distance and separation between them. Daniel knew it was her. His heart stopped. He got out of the car slowly, afraid that any sudden movement would shatter this moment like glass. "Olivia?" She turned, and when she saw him, her hand went to her mouth and her eyes filled with tears. "Daniel." He walked toward her across the rocky ground, and with every step, a piece of the armor he'd built around his heart cracked open. They didn't kiss. They didn't embrace. They simply stood looking at each other like 2 people trying to convince themselves that the other was real and not some elaborate hallucination brought on by years of longing. Olivia looked like someone who had survived something difficult. Her hair had grayed at the temples. Her face had lines that hadn't been there 7 years ago, the kind of lines that came from stress and worry and sleepless nights. She was thinner, almost fragile looking, and when Daniel finally reached her, he could see that her hands were shaking. "Where have you been?" The question came out raw, broken. Daniel hadn't prepared for how his voice would sound when he finally asked it. Olivia looked down at the rocky ground beneath their feet. The ocean crashed against the cliffs behind them, and for a long moment, she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I wanted to tell you everything. The story came out in fragments, like Olivia was pulling it from somewhere deep inside that she kept locked away for 7 years. Her father had been involved in business dealings that were complicated and dangerous. Daniel had never known the full extent of it because Olivia's family didn't really talk about it, but it was a kind of business where powerful people made threats and safety was always conditional. Weeks after Daniel left for Mumbai, those threats became very real. Authorities had discovered that Olivia's father was being targeted, and more than that, her entire family was at risk. People who did business with her father were dangerous. People who were connected to her father could become leverage. Olivia had been given a choice, though it wasn't really a choice at all. She could either disappear, enter protective custody, start a new life where nobody could find her and use her as a tool against her family, or she could stay and potentially bring violence and danger to everyone she loved, including the man she was going to marry. She'd chosen to disappear. "I tried to contact you," Olivia whispered. "After 3 weeks, I managed to call your office, but they told me, the people protecting me told me, that if I made contact with you, they could find me, and if they found me, they could hurt you. They said the safest thing I could do was make you believe I was gone forever." Daniel stared at her through tears that had begun to flow without his permission. "You could have found a way," he said. "You could have left me a note. You could have." "I tried." Her voice broke. "I wrote you letters. Hundreds of letters. But every single one was intercepted. I wasn't allowed to send anything that could be traced. I wasn't allowed to call. I wasn't allowed to contact anyone from my old life. I wasn't even allowed to tell my parents where I was." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them processing the weight of what she was saying. 7 years of silence wasn't abandonment. It was protection. It was sacrifice. It was a choice so impossibly painful that Daniel's mind could barely contain it. "I tried for 3 years to get in contact with you," Olivia continued. 3 years of begging the people protecting me. 3 years of working with lawyers. 3 years of trying to find a way around the restrictions. But the situation stayed dangerous. My father's business disputes didn't resolve. The threats didn't stop. For the first few years, I was moved 5 times. I lived in 3 different states. I had 3 different names. Daniel reached out and took her hand. It felt small and fragile in his, and he was terrified of holding too tightly. How did you manage to send the letter?" Olivia smiled sadly. It was barely a smile, just the ghost of one. "My father died 2 years ago. The man who was after him, the one creating all the danger, he went to prison. The threat assessment changed. But it took time for the paperwork to work through the system. And by then, I'd been living my life for so long as someone else that I didn't know if I had the right to come back and disrupt your world." "You have every right." "Do I?" She pulled her hand away gently and turned to look at the ocean. "Daniel, I'm not the same person you loved in Chicago. I can't go back to that version of myself. And you've had 7 years to build a life that didn't include me." Before Daniel could respond, he heard a sound behind him, the sound of small feet on gravel. He turned and saw the little girl from the photograph. She was real, not just captured in time on glossy paper, but small and present and watching him with the kind of wary curiosity that only children possess. "Who is she?" Daniel asked, even though he already suspected the answer. Olivia smiled, and this time it was genuine, tender in a way that made Daniel's heart ache. "My daughter, her name is Sophie." Daniel looked at the child, then back at Olivia. The girl had Olivia's eyes, dark and expressive, but something else in her face that Daniel couldn't quite place. She was looking at him like she was trying to solve an equation. "Her father?" Daniel asked quietly. Olivia took a deep breath that seemed to cost her a great deal. "He died before she was born." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Daniel looked back at the little girl, then at Olivia, his mind trying to do math that it couldn't quite manage. "You built a whole life without me," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "I had to." Olivia's voice was steady now, but there was pain beneath it. "I couldn't stay frozen waiting for someone who might never come. I couldn't raise my daughter in limbo. I had to believe that you'd moved on, that you'd found someone else, that you built the kind of life we'd always talk about together, but with someone new. Daniel felt years of pain rising inside him like a wave that had been building strength in the deep ocean, and now it was finally hitting the shore. The pain of 7 years of wondering. The pain of loving someone he couldn't reach. The pain of imagining all the life he'd missed, all the moments that belonged to Olivia but not to him. But beneath the pain was something else. Something stronger and more complex than anger or grief. It was hope. "I never stopped loving you," he said. The words sounded inadequate, too small for the thing he was trying to express. Not for a single day. Not for a single moment. Olivia began to cry. Not the quiet tears from when he first arrived, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere profound. "I never stopped loving you either. Every single day. I loved you. Every morning when I woke up, I thought about you. Every night when Sophie fell asleep, I cried thinking about what we'd lost." They did embrace then. Daniel held Olivia like she was the only real thing in a world that had become abstract and painful. She held him back, her small frame pressing against his chest, and they both cried for all the days they'd lost and all the days they might not get to have. Sophie watched them with the serious expression of a child who understood that something important was happening, even if she couldn't quite comprehend what it was. Then Daniel heard the sound of a car and footsteps approaching from behind him. He felt Olivia stiffen in his arms. She turned around and her face went pale. A man in a dark coat approached them, his expression unreadable. "Your last chance," the man said. He handed Daniel a sealed envelope. Daniel's hands were shaking as he opened it. Inside was a legal document, official-looking and stamped with various seals. As he read it, his mind tried to process what the words meant. Olivia's protective status had been lifted. The restrictions had been removed. She was free to live her life openly, to communicate with whoever she wanted, to choose her own path. She was no longer trapped. Daniel looked up from the document to Olivia. "What does this mean?" She smiled through her tears. "It means I'm free." "Does this mean you're coming home?" She smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through 7 years of clouds. "Only if you still have room for me." Daniel laughed, a sound that came from somewhere deep and genuine. It had been so long since he'd really laughed that it felt foreign on his lips. "I've been saving that room for 7 years," he said. They embraced again, and this time it felt like a promise being made rather than a question being answered. Sophie reached out and tugged on Olivia's sleeve, saying something about being hungry, and Olivia looked at Daniel with a question in her eyes. "There's a place in town," Daniel said. "Small diner. They make good food." "Okay," Olivia said simply, as if 7 years could be reduced to something as simple and ordinary as going to a diner. As they walked away from the lighthouse, back toward the car, Daniel kept his hand on Olivia's back. He was terrified that if he let go, she would disappear again. Sophie walked between them, occasionally looking up at Daniel with curious eyes, as if trying to place him in the narrative of her life. The ocean continued to crash against the rocks behind them, indifferent and eternal. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful in a way that hurt, because beautiful moments, Daniel had learned, are never free. They always cost you something. But as he watched Olivia smiling at their daughter, as he felt the reality of her presence beside him, he decided that some costs are worth paying. Some moments are worth the years of suffering that came before them. Love doesn't disappear when two people are separated. Sometimes it waits quietly in the heart, surviving every distance, every obstacle, and every painful year. And when fate finally opens the door, the bravest thing you can do is walk through it, into the uncertain future, holding the hand of the person who changed your life with a single laugh 7 years ago. The diner smelled like coffee and apple pie, the kind of place that probably hadn't changed much since the 1950s. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, a jukebox in the corner playing music from decades past. Olivia ordered pancakes, though it was evening, and Sophie got grilled cheese with fries. Daniel ordered the same thing Sophie was having because he found he couldn't taste anything except the surreal fact that he was sitting across from Olivia in this small town in Maine. They talked, but it was strange, stilted in places. 7 years was a long time. They weren't the same people anymore. The young man and woman who had spilled coffee on a book in Chicago didn't exist anymore. They had been replaced by versions of themselves that had lived through separate worlds, accumulated separate stories, built separate identities. Reconnecting wasn't like picking up where they left off. It was like meeting someone new, except you also carried the weight of knowing them before. "Tell me about your life," Daniel said. "Before this, I mean, how did you survive?" Olivia cut her pancakes into precise pieces, taking time to answer. "The first year was the hardest. I was in a city I didn't know, with a new name, a handler who checked on me constantly, and the absolute conviction that I'd made a terrible mistake. I thought about trying to run, or finding a way to contact you, or just giving up and walking into the ocean." She said it simply matter-of-factly, which somehow made it more devastating. "The second year, I took it as a challenge. I needed to build a life that made sense, that felt real. I got a job at a library. It felt safe, surrounded by books, helping people find stories. I started going to a therapist who specialized in people in the program. She helped me understand that I wasn't a victim of my circumstances. I was a survivor." Sophie was eating fries methodically, listening to her mother with the kind of complete attention that children give to familiar stories they never tire of hearing. By the third year, I realized I was pregnant. It was an accident, or maybe not an accident. Maybe some part of me was trying to create something that belonged to me, something that couldn't be taken away. The father was someone I cared about, but he was also someone who existed in my old life, in a way. When I told him, he didn't respond well. He moved on. But Sophie became my purpose. She smiled down at her daughter, and Daniel could see the entire history of their relationship written in that smile. 7 years of sacrifice. 7 years of being Olivia's entire world. "What happened to her father?" Daniel asked gently. Olivia's smile faded. He was involved in the investigation, not in a criminal way. But he knew people who were dangerous. When it became clear that staying near me would put him at risk, I made him leave. He wanted to know Sophie, but I couldn't let him. I couldn't risk bringing danger to her. Daniel understood then. She hadn't just sacrificed herself. She'd sacrificed all of it. Her relationship with her family, her connection to her past, her chance at a normal love story with another person. Everything. "I want to tell you something," Daniel said. "Something I realized while I was driving to Maine. I came expecting to rescue you, to fix things, to go back to the way things were. But that's not what I can do. And I think, hearing your story, that's not what you need." Olivia looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What I can do is try to understand who you become, who you are now. And I can tell you that I love that person too. Maybe even more than I love the girl from the coffee shop. Because you survived things. You've built something. You're stronger than you were before." The look on Olivia's face changed, shifted into something that looked like relief mixed with pain. "I'm afraid," she said quietly. "I'm afraid of letting you down. I'm afraid that when the novelty of this reunion wears off, you'll realize that I'm not the person you've been carrying in your heart. I'm afraid that Sophie will get attached to you, and then you'll decide this is too complicated. I'm afraid that I don't know how to be in love with someone in the regular world anymore. Everything in me is trained to hide, to not trust, to expect the worst." "Then we learn together," Daniel said. "We learn what it means to trust again. We learn what it means to be a family. Not the family we were supposed to be, but a family that makes sense for who we are now." Sophie had stopped eating and was watching them both with serious eyes. "Are you going to be my dad?" she asked Daniel suddenly. The question was so direct, so loaded with possibility, that Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's something you and your mom need to decide. But I'd like to know you, and I'd like to be in your life if that's okay." Sophie considered this with the gravity of a business negotiation. Then she dipped a fry in ketchup and offered it to him. "Okay," she said. "You can have a fry." Something inside Daniel broke open. Not in a bad way, but in the way that living things break open when they finally get the rain they've been waiting for their entire lives. They talked until the diner closed. Then Daniel drove them back to the small rental house that Olivia had been living in, a modest place with a beautiful view of the ocean. Sophie fell asleep in the car, and when they arrived, Olivia carried her inside, tucking her into bed with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. When she came back out, she and Daniel sat on the porch, listening to the sound of the ocean. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "I have to ask something," Olivia said eventually. "Did you ever love anyone else?" In all this time, Daniel was quiet. "No, I dated people. Because everyone told me I should. I had relationships that lasted a few months. But it was never real. It was never the way it was with you. It was like I was trying to force myself to feel something that I'd already given away completely." "That makes me sad," Olivia said, "that you wasted 7 years on me." "It wasn't wasted," Daniel said. "It hurt, but it wasn't wasted. Those years taught me something important. That real love isn't about convenience or timing or whether the other person's available. It's something that exists independent of circumstances. It's a commitment you make to your own heart." Olivia reached over and took his hand. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "I don't know if I can move back to Chicago, or if you can stay here, or if there's some third place we could build something new. I don't know how to be in a relationship with someone after 7 years of isolation. I don't know if I can trust that this won't disappear again. No one knows what comes next," Daniel said. "That's the terrifying part and the beautiful part about being alive. But I know that I love you, and I know that I want to try. And I think that's enough to start with." Over the next few weeks, Daniel found himself living in a state of profound uncertainty. He rented a small apartment in the coastal town. He took a leave of absence from his job, telling his boss that there was a family emergency, which was technically true. He spent his days with Olivia and Sophie, learning their rhythms, finding out what kind of woman Olivia had become. She was different from the girl he'd loved. She was quieter in some ways, more guarded. She had nightmares sometimes, wake up startled and afraid. She had triggers. Certain situations or conversations could send her back to fear of being discovered, of having to run again. But she was also more capable, more resilient, more real. She worked at a bookstore now, and she talked about the books with a passion that reminded Daniel of why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. She loved with her whole heart, even though she'd learned that hearts could be broken. Sophie was a walking reminder of everything Olivia had sacrificed and survived. She was smart and funny and curious, and she had her mother's eyes and something else, some quality of wisdom that came from being raised by someone who had learned to see danger and opportunity in everything. One night, about 3 weeks after Daniel's arrival, Olivia told him that she wanted to try. She didn't explain what she meant, but she didn't need to. They both knew she was talking about trying to build something together. "I'm going to mess this up," she said. "I might run. I might get afraid. I might not know how to be what you need." "Probably," Daniel said, "and I might do the same. But at least we'll be honest about it. We'll know that we're doing the best we can." He kissed her for the first time in 7 years on the porch of her rental house, with the sound of the ocean in the background and the moon lighting the sky above them. It was different from the kisses they'd shared before, less about passion and more about recognition, like two people acknowledging that they had found each other again. Sophie didn't approve of the kissing. She found them the next morning and rolled her eyes in a way that was too adult for her 6-year-old face. In the following months, they began the complicated work of building a life together. Daniel extended his leave of absence, then eventually resigned from his job. He took on freelance projects and slowly began designing a house, not for a client, but for them, on the coast near the lighthouse where Olivia had waited for him. A house that represented a beginning after an ending, a choice to build something new rather than trying to reconstruct something old. Olivia applied for and got a grant to open a community reading center, a place where people could come to access books and stories. It was the kind of work that had meaning to her, that felt like it was part of her purpose. Sophie adapted to having Daniel in their lives with the flexibility of a child who hadn't yet learned that change was supposed to be difficult. She called him Daniel at first, then Mr. Daniel. Then eventually, one day without ceremony or announcement, she started calling him Dad. When Daniel heard her say it for the first time, it undid him. He had to excuse himself and cry in the bathroom, because the weight of it, the trust, the acceptance, the second chance, was too much to contain. That night, he asked Olivia to marry him, not with a ring, because he wanted her to choose if she wanted one, but with words. He asked her in the kitchen while she was making dinner, and she said yes while crying, and Sophie started jumping around screaming, because something exciting was happening. They didn't get married right away. They took their time. They wanted to make sure this was real, that it could survive the complications and challenges of a life built on the ashes of a life interrupted. Sometimes Olivia had nightmares. Sometimes Daniel struggled with the reality of the years they'd lost. Sometimes Sophie asked questions about her first father that were difficult to answer. But they worked through these things because that's what people do when they've discovered that love is more resilient than they thought. 3 years after the letter arrived with no return address, Olivia and Daniel stood on the steps of a small church in Maine and made promises they meant with every part of themselves. Sophie was a ring bearer, and she took her role very seriously, walking down the aisle like she was carrying the most important thing in the world, which, in a way, she was. Daniel's old best friend Marcus flew in for the wedding, and when he saw Daniel happy in a way he'd never been before, he understood something he hadn't been able to understand before. Love isn't about logic. It's not about convenience or timing or reasonable expectations. It's about recognizing that some people are worth waiting for, worth suffering for, worth building an entire life around. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of the beginning. Because the real story, the one that mattered most, was in the everyday moments that followed. It was in Sophie laughing while Daniel taught her to ride a bike. It was in Olivia and Daniel dancing in the kitchen while dinner cooked. It was in the nights they'd sit together on the porch, watching the stars, not needing to speak, because they'd learned that presence itself was a form of communication. It was in the moment when Sophie, completely unselfconsciously, said something about, "When I was little," even though she was only 9 years old, and Olivia caught Daniel's eye and they both smiled, understanding that healing had happened without either of them trying to force it. It had simply unfolded day by day, moment by moment. One evening, Olivia found Daniel in the house they'd built together, in the room that was supposed to be his office, but that he converted into a study. He had something spread out on the desk, old photographs from Chicago, images from the coffee shop, pictures of the apartment they used to talk about having together. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I was thinking," Daniel said, "about writing a book, about our story. About what it means to love someone even when the world is trying to keep you apart. About how people survive impossible things. About second chances." Olivia looked at the photographs, at the evidence of their history spread across the desk. "Would it be a sad book?" she asked. "It could be," Daniel said, "but I think it would be more of a true book. Sad and beautiful at the same time. Because that's what our story is." She sat down next to him and took his hand. It fit perfectly in hers, the way it always had. "Then write it," she said. "But make sure you write the part about the lighthouse. That's my favorite part." Daniel smiled. "The lighthouse," he repeated. "The place where it all came back together." "Yes," Olivia said. "The lighthouse. Where I was waiting without knowing I was waiting. Where you came without knowing if you'd find me. Where Sophie got to meet the man her mother never stopped loving." That night, Daniel began writing. Not the book, but a letter to himself from 7 years ago. A letter to the younger version of himself who was getting on a plane to Mumbai, thinking that 6 months was a long time, not understanding yet what real waiting meant. He wanted to tell him that it would be okay, that the pain would be real and terrible and worth surviving, that love would turn out to be stronger than distance, than doubt, than fear, that second chances weren't just something that happened in movies and books. They were something you could build, brick by brick, moment by moment, if you were willing to be brave enough to try. Sophie was asleep upstairs. Olivia was reading on the porch. Outside, the ocean continued its endless conversation with the shore, talking about cycles and return, and the way that things which seem lost can sometimes find their way home. Daniel had spent 7 years convinced that his greatest tragedy was losing Olivia. But sitting there in the study of the house they'd built together, with the sound of his wife's soft breathing from the porch, with the knowledge that Sophie was safe and loved upstairs, Daniel realized something that changed the way he understood his entire life. He hadn't lost those 7 years. They had been part of the journey. They had been the thing that taught him what he was willing to suffer for. They had been the fire that burned away everything superficial, leaving behind only what was true. The greatest gift wasn't that he got Olivia back. The greatest gift was that he learned to love in a way that transcended circumstance, a love that survived distance and time, and the worst that the world could throw at it. Sometimes people asked him how they did it, how they managed to rebuild after 7 years of separation, how they managed to create something real after everything had fallen apart. And Olivia and Daniel would look at each other and smile, because the answer wasn't complicated or profound. It was simple and human, and something anyone could understand if they'd ever loved someone enough to wait. They did it because the alternative was unbearable. They did it because love, real love, doesn't give you a choice. And they did it because they'd learned, in the hardest way possible, that some people are worth coming back for, that some hearts are worth waiting for, that some stories are too important to end, even when the world tries to write the end on them. That when you love someone the way Olivia and Daniel loved each other, no distance, no circumstance, no matter what the world throws at you, love finds a way home. And that, more than anything, is what makes us human.